Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Navratil. I'm the Democracy Commitment Coordinator on campus, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. Today's event is in commemoration of Illinois' bicentennial. If you didn't know, on December 3rd of this year, we're going to be celebrating 200 years as a state. And in light of that, we thought it would be a great opportunity to bring one of our elected officials, Senator Bill Cunningham, to our campus today to talk to about some of the challenges that our state faces, some of the strengths of our state, talk about some of his experience that he's had working down in Springfield. So just a little bit about Senator Cunningham. He has represented the 18th district of 18th district in the Illinois Senate for the past 5 years. If you don't know, the 18th district has several communities in Moraine Valley, including Palos, Worth, and Orland. He serves on several committees, including the vice chair of the Higher Education Committee, and he is the chair of the Telecommunications and Information Technology Committee. He has also served as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives from 2011 to 2013. And before that, for about 20 years, he worked in the Cook County Sheriff's Office. So please join me in welcoming Senator Bill Cunningham to our campus today.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks. Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm sorry a little bit late, like you guys probably do frequently. I was battling the parking lot for a while, looking for a spot. So I'm sorry I'm a little bit late. Thanks for coming out. It was a really good crowd. As was mentioned, I'll go over a little bit about what I do, what my job's like, what the state of the state is, and then I'd like to turn it over to questions. And anytime I speak to groups like this, especially students, I like for the discussion to be driven by questions as much as possible. So I'm a state senator. What does that mean? There's 59 state senators in Illinois. Each district has about 216,000 residents in it. So my district, we're in my district right now, Moraine Valley. Most of the Moraine Valley attendance area is in my district. My district goes from the Will Cook boundary in the west, goes as far north as I have a little section of a couple blocks in Willow Springs, as far south as 171st Street and Orland Hills. And then I go as far east as about 83rd in Ashland in the city. So I have Chicago neighborhoods like Beverly, Morgan Park, Auburn, Gresham, Mount Greenwood in my district. Suburbs like all the Paluses, Oak Lawn, Evergreen Park, Orland Park, Worth, Chicago Ridge, many other surrounding suburbs in my district. Like I said, about 216,000 people. And it's my job to represent you in Springfield. One of the things, just sort of putting things, in a statewide perspective here, given that it's our 200th anniversary, Illinois is a really big state. I always knew that, but didn't fully realize it until I became a member of the General Assembly. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I was in the House of Representatives for 2 years, and now I've been in the Senate for about 5. It really dawns on you how big of a state it is when your seatmate, my seatmate in the Senate for several years, has such a deep Southern accent that I sometimes had a hard time understanding him. He represented the southern tip of the state. You can drive in Illinois, if you drive from the Wisconsin border to the southern tip of the state, which, a town called Cairo, that's about a 420-mile drive. Okay, that's the same distance you would drive if you went from Midtown Manhattan in New York to North Carolina. So think about the amount of real estate you're covering. That's a lot of ground. It's also physically a lot of ground. It's also a lot of ground on the ideological spectrum. People in Manhattan don't think about politics and government the same way people in rural North Carolina do. Now imagine putting that whole swath of America in one state, and that's what you have in Illinois. A very big, very diverse state. People whose attitudes about government and politics and culture differ a lot. So that's something we deal with in the General Assembly down in Springfield on a daily basis. And it can lead to a lot of problems. We've seen an increase in regionalism in the state over the last few years. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can get into it. All that stuff was made all the worse in recent years over the budget battle that I think you're all familiar with, that we basically just pulled out of in the last year. Something that did real damage to our state, including people like yourself, people who are involved in higher education. Of all the areas of our budget that were damaged by the standoff, higher education was arguably hurt the most. For a couple of years in a row, colleges and universities did not get their usual disbursement from the state government. So I've considered my task in Springfield to be driven by an effort to sort of break down these ideological boundaries that are in place and these regional boundaries that have come up. And I've tried to do that in a couple different ways. For instance, I serve on, one of the committees I serve on is the Agriculture Committee. Now, you know, there's a couple of working farms in my district, but not many. I'm one of the few Chicago members. In fact, I chaired it for a year when the chairman stepped down. I was the first Chicago-based legislator to ever chair the Illinois Senate Agriculture Committee. So that's one of the ways I go to Springfield and try to learn about problems and issues that are really important in other parts of the state, but maybe not so important to those of us who live around here. I think that makes me a better legislator. I think when legislators do that, it helps make us a better state. And I think that's the only way we sort of break down some of these regional and political differences that we've seen in the state the last couple of years. Because, you know, the problems that causes, the log jam in government and budget crisis really hurts the state. You know, we've seen outflow of population. I think that has been contributed, that this deadlock in government has contributed to. We've seen our economy, our economic growth lag behind the national average, and government not doing its role to address that. So that's always been my commitment to, while I've been in Springfield, is to try to work past some of those divisions that exist. And we've had some successes. I mean, we went 2.5 years with this budget stalemate. That was broken up last summer. This last spring, we agreed on a budget for the first time in 4 years, a bipartisan budget. So I think that probably happened because the governor was running for re-election and didn't want to run for re-election, having served 4 years without having a budget in place. But whatever the reason, it was a good thing, and it's helped put the state, I think, back on a road to recovery. One of the things that I would hope all of you would be interested in, I would invite you to get involved, you know, in any different ways. Obviously start off by voting, but also by getting involved in your community. You know, I'll tell you something. So, you know, one of the things day in and day out that's really important to me and to any legislator, if they want to get reelected, is that you are concentrated on constituent services. And, you know, what are constituent services? It's looking out for the people you represent, making sure if they're having problems cutting through red tape in some government agency, that you help them do that. You know, that's, you know, just one example of it. I try to do that by staying in touch with and being accessible to my constituents. I'm a full-time legislator. Not all legislators are. I'm in my office or in Springfield every day, or coming to forums like this. One weekend every month, I hold with one of my state representatives a coffee and conversation where we just sit down for an hour or two at a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts somewhere in the district and advertise it on social media and in the newspapers and invite people to come and see us. We do evening office hours. Later tonight, I'll be at the school district in Evergreen Park having a town hall meeting. I try to be accessible, try to find out what people are thinking about, and make sure they're getting the government services that they pay for with their tax dollars, and making sure their views are represented in Springfield. So I'm very reactionary, as all politicians are, to what we hear from our constituents. And you know, I'll give you an example. So especially when we're in session, Every morning, the first thing I do is log into my email and see what sort of emails I've received from my constituents the evening before. Sometimes if there's a big, important, controversial bill up, I could get 100 emails, overnight. And I'll look through them, and a lot of times there'll be, form letters that were organized by some group to contact me about a certain issue. And I'll see they've come from all over the state, Effingham, Elmhurst, Schaumburg, the north side of Chicago. I pay little attention when I get an email from someone who doesn't live in my district. But if I see that person lives in Palos Hills or in Mount Greenwood or Evergreen Park, I pay attention because that person could fire me. They could vote against me. They can knock me out of office. That's the way most elected officials react. The other thing is I look at is who's contacting me, and I'll tell you, just if you want to guess what age group I represent, I hear from the most. Anyone want to guess? If go by age group, the age group I hear from the most, yes? Seniors. That's right. So I hear from senior citizens about their property taxes, about their Medicaid and Medicare benefits. Some things, Medicare is a federal program I have nothing to do with, but I hear about that. I don't hear much from people around your age, and I'm not alone. Most politicians would tell you that's the exact same phenomenon they deal with. So government is very responsive to the needs of senior citizens because senior citizens vote. We give them property tax exemptions. We give them a break on their public transit costs. We're reacting to the people who contact us and the people that vote. Young people are underrepresented in that regard. So, I would say that there's no accident that when there's a budget crisis, what's one of the first things that gets held up? MAP funding. Many people here, school on a MAP grant. A big portion, about a third of the students here at Moraine Valley get MAP grants. So that's not an accident, that when there's a budget crunch and things are cut, that items that benefit people around your age are the first to be frozen or the first to go. And that's because of a relative lack of engagement from younger people. So I would encourage you to help change that. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, an old saying, and that applies to politics as much as it applies to anything else. So that's a basic rundown. Could certainly get into more details, but like I said, I would like to keep this driven by questions as much as possible. So just open it up to anyone has any questions, thoughts, complaints?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What's the most common problem that you're emailed with, or you have no letter about?
Okay, you asked what the most common problem that I get contacted by. It's hard to say because it really varies, from time to time. Kind of depends what the hot issue is. The thing that the media tends to be focused on, a bill that's up in Springfield, that will bring the most, any given day, the most concern, complaints, contact from constituents. But a consistent theme, I would say the thing that I hear about more than anything else is property taxes. If I go walking around, as I do from time to time, and knock on doors in my district and talk to people and ask them, what's your biggest concern? They'll mention property taxes. That is pretty consistent, and I think most people in my position would tell you that. In Illinois, we have, people talk about taxation and compare Illinois to other states. Illinois, relatively speaking, is actually a low income tax state, particularly if you compare Illinois to other big states like ours that are similar to ours. Our income tax is on the low end. A lot of people don't believe that. It happens to be true. Property taxes are on the high end. We have among the highest property taxes in the country, second highest to New Jersey by most metrics I see. That is not an accident. One of the reasons our property taxes are high is because our income taxes are relatively low. most states, I'll give you an example of this, one of the biggest bins in our budget is education funding. In most states, the majority of funding that goes to school, to the average school district, comes from that state. You know, if you lived in New York or California and went to your local public school, most of the money, not all, there's federal sources, state sources, local sources, but in most places, the biggest chunk of money coming in to operate that school comes from state government. That is not the case in Illinois. It comes from your local government. Only about a third of funding at an average Illinois public school district comes from the state. Most of it, depending on your district, if you're in a real poor district, you get more state money, more federal money. If you're in a more affluent district, like District 118, which is the elementary school district we're in right now, most of the money comes from property taxes. So they're connected. I think that's a bad system because property taxes have very little to do with your ability to pay property taxes have very little to do with your income. I mean, obviously, if you make more money, odds are you're going to have a bigger house, a more valuable house. You're going to pay more property taxes. But you know, there's not the exact correlation there with income. So we have a system here that puts a lot of pressure on middle-class families to fund their public schools. That's why your property taxes are low and your income tax, or your property taxes are high, and your income taxes are relatively low in Illinois. And that's why I hear the thing I hear the most from my constituents, the complaint I hear about the most is about the high level of property taxes.
All right, so we have a question back here.
Yes, sir.
How many campaign meetings do you do in a week? Campaign events, fundraisers?
Okay, he asked well, he was on the microphone, so you heard him. So right now I'm kind of lucky. So I'm on the ballot in November, but I do not have an opponent. This is the first time I've run where no one filed to run against me. I like to think it's because I'm doing a great job, but it just might be dumb luck. I don't know. So that means I'm spending less time than I would normally spend raising money, for sure. As I said, I'm a full-time legislator. Probably about a third of the members of the General Assembly in Springfield, maybe a little bit more, are full-time legislators. I do this 40, 50, 60 hours a week, no matter what, whether it's campaign time or not. I speak to groups like this. I do some of those constituent outreach programs I talked to you about, but that really hasn't changed much. What has changed without having an opponent is not having to raise money, and that allows me to concentrate more on doing my job. When I was in the House, you run every 2 years, and one of the problems, and this is kind of unique to Illinois too, we have a real early primary. Every year we have a primary in March. That's unusual. That's really near the front end. So when you're running in 2-year terms, you're always running. It's always campaign season. You get sworn in January. And by August, you have to get your petitions out on the street to appear on the ballot in the March primary. So you're never not running. You're never not raising money. When I was running 4 years ago, I had an opponent, and I'm a Democrat. The Republicans, Governor Rauner gave him like $150,000 in seed money, and he put out like a 9 or 10 piece mail program blasting me. So that kicked me into overdrive. I had to raise money to counteract that. I think when elected officials are busy raising money, that's probably a bad thing. We should be more, we should concentrate more on doing forums like this and being responsive to constituent services and having to spend less time on raising money, but that's the reality of it. If you want to get reelected, it's a necessary evil.
Hi, I was wondering where the funding for the MAP grants comes from.
Okay, the funding from the MAP grant comes from the General Revenue Fund in the state. That's the main operating fund that the state has. That is compiled by the taxes you pay. If you work, the income taxes you pay on your that you see come out of your check every week, the sales tax you pay when you buy something. You pay 6.25% of sales tax on most items that you buy. That goes into the general revenue fund. The general revenue fund then goes to MAP grants. General revenue fund this year is going to be about $38 billion. The state raises about another $35 billion, give or take $1 billion, from other special funds. That might be, if any of you are going to be teachers, the fund you pay for your teacher's license goes into a special fund. That's replenished by a lot of fees. The motor fuel tax that you pay when you buy gas, that goes into a special fund. But most of the money goes into the general revenue fund. That's how we pay it out. When we had the budget stalemate, that money was, even though it was still being collected, when we had the budget shut down, you were still paying taxes. Money was still coming into the state. And we were still spending money. We were spending money without a spending plan, which is never a good idea. Really blew up the number of bills we have and the state debt. And it was spent based on court orders. So what happened during the budget stalemate is various legal groups went into court and asked for judicial orders to keep paying state employees, to keep funding programs for people with developmental disabilities. And the judges said, okay, and they handed those court orders and said, State Illinois, we don't care that you don't have a budget. You have to pay these bills. You have to keep funding these programs. And we did. But there was no lawsuit filed for MAP recipients. So that's why that wasn't funded. There was no lawsuit filed on behalf of higher education, so higher education didn't get funded. And it created a lot of damage to our higher education community in the state, and I think it's going to take us a while to get out of it. How many of you guys, when you were in high school a couple of years ago, had guidance counselors tell you, you said, oh, I want to study this, I want to study that. I heard a lot of stories like this, so I'm anxious to hear if you guys heard this, but had guidance counselors tell me, I don't know if you want to go to school in Illinois. That college or that university might not offer that program because of the budget standoff. I mean, my daughter graduated from high school in the middle of this, and she was told that by some of our counselors. So that's helped increase the number of students that have left the state, and that's potentially really damaging long term because it might not come back. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned at the beginning that our economy is lagging behind the national average.
Mm-hmm.
So from the standpoint of someone who's one of our government managers, what should government's role be in the state economy?
Okay, we have lagged behind economic growth in other states. Our unemployment rate is a little bit higher than the national average. I think there's a couple of things that we can do about that. One is we've gone 10 years in the state without doing a major capital development plan where we invest in our roads, our rails, public transportation, and building schools. That, to me, would give our economy a shot that it desperately needs, would help increase the number of jobs that are available, and would helping our transportation network in particular, which is a really important part of the economy here in Illinois, I think would help speed up the economy. That's something that I think we need to do, and I'm optimistic we will do early next year, and I think that'll help. I think we also need to, one of the things that's hurt the state, and you guys maybe have studied this in school in different classes, is about some of the changes to our economy and how it's transformed our economy. It's created a lot of economic and political anxiety in the country. Illinois was very much sort of an old school economic state, an industrial state, an agricultural state. Those sectors of the economy have been affected, mostly for the worse, more than others. So we have to adapt. We have to incentivize the technology. We have to realize the things that we have that are resources beneficial. We're in the middle of the country. That makes us a transportation hub. We need to take advantage of that. The warehousing and think about the way things have changed, how goods are delivered. You pull out your phone, you go on Amazon, you want something on your front door at the end of the day or the next day. We have to invest in roads, airports, in order to deliver those things. And if we can, our economy will grow with other natural growth sectors in the economy. We haven't done a good enough job of that, and I think that's what we need to focus on. Yes, sir?
What are the top 3 money sinks of Illinois?
The top 3 what?
Money sinks. Like where's our money going?
Okay, money sinks. Okay, it's a good question. So,
Can you just repeat the question?
yeah,
so we
he
can
said,
get
what
on
are the
recording?
top 3 money sinks? Which I assume you mean what do we things we spend the most money on in the state? Okay, so the number one thing when you divide up the state of Illinois' the government budget, what we spend money on. Remember I mentioned that $38 billion in general revenue funds. The biggest chunk goes to Medicaid. Okay, you guys know what Medicaid is a government program to deliver health care to poor people and care to people with developmental disabilities and in some limited ways to senior citizens, okay? That's over $9 billion. That's grown really quick, at a pretty rapid pace over the last 10 or 15 years. We get some federal matching funds with that, but that is the single biggest trough of the budget. After that, it's pretty much a tie between K through or pre-K through 12 education and paying off our pension debt. Those are the next highest, single items in the budget. They're both between like $7 and $8 billion. Pension debt is a real problem in the state. It's gobbling up a bigger and bigger chunk of our budget, and it's basically going to pay bills that the state didn't pay for years. And unlike what you might read in the papers or see on the news, this is not a new problem. Illinois is underfunded its public employee pensions. That would include pensions for your instructors here at Moraine Valley. It would include K through 12 teachers, guards that work in prisons, anyone who works in state government. The state has underfunded that for literally 100 years. It's never made the full payments that were necessary to sustain those pension plans. Starting about 10 years ago, right when the recession hit, the state legally started making what's called the actuarially required contribution to those funds. 15 years ago, well, there were some years the state would pay nothing into the funds, but maybe some years it'd pay $1 or $2 billion. Now we're paying $8 billion. So that's a big chunk of spending. It's money that can't be spent elsewhere. And it's required the state income tax to be raised. 7 or 8 years ago, it was 3%, went up to 5% for a while, then back down. Now it's at 4.95%. Most of that increase is going to pay off that pension debt. So a big legacy problem that, as I said, is 100 years in the making, and unfortunately we have to pay those bills now. Any other questions?
Is that what made it Illinois the most expensive state to live in?
Well, Illinois is not the most expensive state to live in. It has the highest property tax. What are the highest property tax rates? I mean, if you look at cost of living, the other, other bigger, big states on the coast have an actual higher cost of living. Now, having a high cost of living is not all bad. It's a sign of economic growth. The highest cost of living in the country is in San Francisco. It's because the economy there has boomed. It's to the point where people are priced out. I was reading something in a magazine about Silicon Valley and talked about how it's gotten so expensive to live there that companies are having trouble hiring people. One of the things I read about is the San Francisco School District contemplating buying a big apartment building in downtown San Francisco as a place for their teachers to live at reduced rate, because they can't hire teachers because teachers cannot afford to live within an hour and a half drive of their schools because the economy and the cost of living is so high in and around San Francisco. So we do have a higher cost of living than rural areas, than other Midwestern cities, but not as high as the cost of living on the coasts. Yes, ma'am.
One of the biggest problems we've had is the people leaving the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true in higher ed. That affects higher ed because many, you kind of alluded to this earlier, many of our students are also leaving.
That's right.
So what is the state legislator doing to try to stem that out?
Okay, it is true. We've had out-migration of people the last couple years. Just to go back, sort of a history lesson, Illinois has lost population to the relative to the rest of the country since the end of World War II. That's when we had our peak. If you study political history, that's when we had the most electoral college votes. And the reason that's happened has a lot to do with air conditioning. I mean, people moved to the Sun Belt starting in the late 40s and 50s because of air conditioning. And that's affected New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. All the northern industrial states have lost population relative to the rest of the country ever since the end of World War II. We've seen that accelerate in recent years in Illinois. Most of that population loss is not in the Chicago area. In fact, the Chicago area has seen its population go up. Most of the population loss in Illinois is downstate. So we used to, a lot of the sort of the mid-size towns in Illinois, Rockford, Peoria, the Quad Cities, Decatur, used to be in industrial centers where we built like things like tractors. Those jobs are gone. I mean, there's a fraction of them left. That gets to the bigger economic changes. The other thing that has really changed Illinois' economy, and it's overlooked in these bigger picture discussions about the sort of hollowing out of the middle class, and that's automation. Okay, our agriculture industry used to employ 2 or 3 times the amount of people it does now when you literally had to have farm hands, harvesting crops. Now we have big combines that do it. I saw firsthand a couple of weeks ago, we had a hearing in Springfield, and I took a field trip about an hour south of Springfield to a coal mine. Illinois, believe it or not, for almost 100 years was one of the largest coal-producing states in America, especially in the southern third of the state. A lot of coal mines. I went down a coal mine. It was one of the coolest things I've done since I've been a member of the General Assembly. But I saw this automation I'm talking about firsthand. I saw 3 guys operate this big piece of machinery, one guy working a joystick and 2 guys making sure he wasn't too close to the walls, go into the wall in the coal mine with this big grinding machine, grind coal off the wall into a bin, and another guy drove the bin away. 4 guys doing what 40 years ago took probably 20 guys to do, okay? So those kind of things have really hurt the economy in Illinois and have caused people to leave. That's why population loss has mostly happened downstate. Chicago has seen its population grow. The metropolitan area, the city itself has shrunk, but the metropolitan area is going because Chicago has adapted to the economy. We have technology jobs, finance jobs, banking jobs, advertising, public relations, all those kind of things. So we've seen growth there. So now the question is, what do we do about it? What can we as policymakers do about it? I mentioned a capital program is one thing we can do about it. Taking advantage of transportation. I think we should build a 3rd airport in the south suburbs for cargo to take advantage of it. And if anyone's driven through Will County lately, you'll see this is already happening. There's a new warehouse goes up every other day. Amazon right now is the largest employer in Will County. They employ 4,000 people, I want to say. 5 years ago, they didn't employ 1 person. Now they're the largest employer in that county because they've built 4 or 5 warehouses. That's one of the things we have to focus on. Water is a resource, fresh water. When I was a college student, when I was your age, I had a professor, I went to UIC, tell us that Illinois, Chicago region's access to fresh water is going to make us the Texas of the American economy in 20 or 30 years. Now, he said that 30 years ago, so he's a little bit off in time, but that is a resource that I don't think we're taking proper advantage of. Foxconn, I don't know if you're familiar with this, they make flat TV screens. They just moved their factory into southern Wisconsin because they need access to fresh water. That's something we need to do. I think we can lure companies that need fresh water with incentives. Basically tell them, we'll give you water free for 5 years, 10 years if you come here, set up roots here and hire a certain number of people. I think we can do those things and help grow our economy. We have to take advantage of our natural resources, our location in the center of the country. Those are things I don't think we're doing and we need to do to keep people to stay here. The other thing is, like we talked about, to keep college students from leaving. Because if they leave, they might not come back. And I think we need to do that by lowering tuition. We've increased funding in Illinois. A lot of people don't believe this, but I met with this group of school superintendents the other day from my district. We've increased funding for K through 12 education in the middle of this budget crisis, the last 4 years, by $1 billion. We have reduced direct aid to higher education. That has resulted in tuition increasing. When I went to college, so when I was a senior in high school, the decision between going to a community college or a state university and an out-of-state public university or a private university, it was all about tuition because it would cost you twice as much to leave the state or to go to a private school. That tuition gap has closed close to nothing. That's why we're losing students. The state does not give enough direct aid to our colleges and universities. Part of that is the pension problem. We spend about $1 billion a year making up for skipped payments to SERS, the State University Retirement System. That's the pension system for university and college employees. We were skipping that for years. So a lot of the money that used to go into classrooms and used to go to tuition reduction, we're now using to pay off pension debt. So that's something that we need to address, and I think that will help staunch the tide of people leaving the state.
Well, I see 3 hands. We'll go here.
Okay.
Here next, and then I'll get to you in the red. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, just one quick question. Can you please just tell me and all of us what exactly happened this year while the budget? What exactly happened? How did we come to the point where MAP funding just stopped?
Okay. Well, I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, in that MAP did not have the advocates I think other spending items did. They also did not have any sort of legal grounds to go to school, or to go to court. At least no one tried that. I suggested to various people in the higher education piece that they should go to school on behalf of MAP recipients and say that MAP recipients were depending on that money for their education and made financial decisions based on that, like went and took out loans and put themselves at financial risk because the state stopped funding MAP grants. No one decided to take up that cause in court. If they did, maybe, I think they didn't because they thought they would lose, but if they did and they were successful, it could have forced the state into making MAP payments. But that's a side thing. You shouldn't have to go to court to get these things funded. Unfortunately, that was the only way people during the budget standoff did get a lot of things funded. So I think the way to make sure this doesn't happen again, that's probably what we should focus on, is getting involved in the kind of advocacy that I talked about. Groups of students, by the way, from Moraine Valley came to Springfield and lobbied me and other legislators. And when you look into the face of someone like yourself, maybe even some of you did this, I don't know, and you hear their story and people tell you, like, listen, if I don't have this grant, I can't go to school. If I can't go to school, I'm not going to get a job. And to see people and hear from people about their personal situation, that really breaks through with legislators. Otherwise, we're just looking at numbers and letters in a budget book or in a chart. So I think that kind of advocacy by each and every one of you goes a long way. And I think that's a way to prevent that kind of problem in the future.
What type of tax contributions do major corporations that are in the area contribute
Okay.
to us?
So we have a corporate tax rate, in the state of Illinois. It's a little bit higher than the income tax rate. A lot of corporations, though, don't pay that. They find a way to pass through their money and pay it like it's personal income. People have proposed addressing that. The problem with changing that formula is you do run the risk of driving businesses out of the state. So that's a potential problem. I think it's something that we have to be really careful about. We can make changes, though, to our tax code that I think will make it fairer and will bring in more revenue to the state to address some of these budget shortfalls we talk about. And I think the best way to do that, and what I'm an advocate for, is putting in place a progressive income tax in the state of Illinois, which would be just like the way we assess taxes in the federal government, just like the way they assess taxes in almost all our neighboring states, and that is to have people with higher income pay a higher rate and people with lower income pay a lower rate. Right now we have a flat tax in Illinois. Everybody pays 4.95% of their income into the state income tax. If you make $35,000 a year, that's what you pay. If you make $3.5 million a year, you pay the same rate. That's not the way the federal government does it. That's not the way they do it in Wisconsin or Iowa or a number of other states around us. They have that graduation. That, I believe, will reduce the tax burden on poor people, on working class, middle class people, and raise the tax burden on wealthier people who can afford to pay it. So I think that's probably the best way to address what I think we have right now is a fundamental unfairness in our taxes. That bleeds over into what we talked about earlier with property taxes. Because we have a flat income tax, we don't generate enough revenue from that income tax. It makes us rely on property taxes. Property taxes are, the burden for property taxes mostly falls on middle class families. So we can relieve that pressure by shifting to a graduated income tax.
Someone like Walmart doesn't really pay taxes?
So we have it's very complicated. So your corporate taxes that you pay in Illinois are based on the profits you make in Illinois as a corporation. So that's what they do. So they pay it based on what they make in the state. So I'll give you an example. Like Caterpillar still makes some tractors here in Illinois. If they sell it to an Illinois farmer, they pay taxes on the profit from that sale. If they sell it to a farmer in China, they don't pay any taxes to the state on the profit on that sale. It's only on in-state, and that's pretty common. A lot of states do it that way. Yes.
So you mentioned you went to UIC, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How much did you spend on UIC, and who paid for it?
So my tuition was about $4,000 or $5,000 a year when I went there. I lived at home. I didn't stay down, and I split it with my parents.
Okay.
We basically did 50-50. I worked when I went to school, and shared the expense with my parents.
In perspective, I currently go to UIC. My
Mhm.
tuition is about $22,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
How come kids with high-income families like me receive literally zero financial aid for the school,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's $22,000? Yep, my parents don't want to pay for it.
Right.
How come we don't have any options besides taking a loan
Right.
for $22K and accumulating another $30K in debt?
You raise a really good point. This is a major problem. It's one of the reasons why we're talking about people have left the state. So we talked about MAP. MAP is a program for lower income students, okay? Students that come from wealthy families, they can afford to pay that. Families in the middle, there's no help. They make too much income to qualify for MAP, but they don't make enough money to just, write checks. So what happens? You end up taking out loans, okay? And you end up carrying debt, which has a long-term negative effect on the economy. I was talking a few years ago to a real estate agent, sells a lot of houses in the southwest suburbs. He was telling me that he feels like the last 10 to 15 years, he's lost an entire portion of his business on people in like their late 20s who can't get a mortgage from a bank because they have high college debt. You know, they're carrying $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in loans, and they go to a bank to get a loan to buy a starter house here in Palos Hills, and the bank says, you already have a mortgage. You owe your $90,000 in college loans. We're not giving you a mortgage. They end up living in an apartment or renting a house. That's not good for the economy. Home ownership is really important aspect of economic growth for the middle class. So this year, we formed in Illinois a higher education working group, a bipartisan collection of legislators from all over the state to address this problem, okay? One of the first things we did is we set up a new grant, and I encourage you to look into this, called Aim High. The state is going to spend $25 million this year on this program. It's going to require each university to match dollar for dollar a scholarship program for students who come from families that have up to, I believe it's $165,000, $170,000 in income. So to address middle class families. A merit-based scholarship where if you get good grades, or grant, not really a scholarship, that will result directly in tuition reimbursement. So if UIC gives you a $2,000 grant, the state legislature will match it with another $2,000, and it will bring your tuition down $4,000, just to pull numbers out of a hat. That to me is a small but important first step. I think we really need to focus on this. I think another thing we need to do, we give out all kinds of tax breaks. A new one that we gave out that we put in the budget, the education budget the year before last, in order to get the governor to sign it, was a scholarship program for private schools. It basically says people can make donations to scholarship granting organizations and write that off on their taxes. And then that scholarship organization gives a grant for K through 12 students to go to a private school. Up to $75 million in tax credits are available for this. I'd rather see if we're going to not collect $75 million in taxes because for an education-related program, I'd rather that go to middle-class families for college tuition. Your parents should be able to write down a portion of the tuition they're paying to an Illinois college or university. That not only will relieve the burden on the middle class, it'll make it easier for Illinois students to stay in the state. So I think that's the next thing we should do. But the other thing we need to do is increase direct aid to education, which, like I said, that's why tuition has gone up. The amount of direct aid coming from the state to colleges and universities has gone down. And a lot of it, the diversion, the dollar for dollar diversion, has gone to pay off the pension debt. That's the problem we have, and what I mentioned, I think, are a couple of the ways we can address it. But a really good question.
Senator, could you talk, you mentioned about how the progressive income tax.
Mm-hmm.
So you're one member of 59. Could you speak a little bit about what would need to happen
Sure.
for something like that to actually become a law?
It's a really good question because, so it's very difficult to do this in Illinois because the flat tax is something that is written into the state constitution. Changing the state constitution is much, much more difficult than just passing a regular bill and changing the law, okay? If I want to change a law, if we want to make this Aim High college grant the law of Illinois, all we need are 60 votes in the House of Representatives, a bare majority, 30 votes in the Senate, and the governor's signature, and that becomes law. And that's what happened with that bill. To change the way we assess income taxes, we need to change the Constitution. In order to change the Constitution, the provision needs to pass both houses of the General Assembly, the House and the Senate, with 3/5 vote, and then the voters, and it goes on the ballot, and the voters have to affirm it through a ballot referendum. That is very difficult to do. There have been similar proposals in the past that have come up just short. For instance, a few years ago, there was a proposal to add a millionaire income tax surcharge that would increase, if you made more than $1 million a year, would increase your income tax by a couple percentage points, and all of it would go into education funding. That fell 2 votes short, needs 67 3/5 votes in the House, 67 votes instead of 60. It fell 2 or 3 votes short in the House of passing. So that is a high, when you put something in the Constitution, it's hard to change. And that's where our tax rates are. So there's a lot of talk about a progressive income tax in Illinois. There's probably even majority support for it. But to change the Constitution, you need supermajority support. And we'll see that's one of the main issues, if you've been paying attention to the governor's race, that's one of the big issues in the race right now. And how the governor's race ends up will probably go a long way to determining what happens on that issue.
Other questions? Over here in the back.
Can you tell me how much of the budget is spent on prisons in Illinois? And then the second part of that question, I've gone to a lot of small towns in Illinois, and I realize that almost all of them have a prison in them. How much of the economy now is based on the prisons that are located there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's an interesting dynamic in Illinois politics, what you just mentioned. We spend about $1 billion a year on the prison system to maintain it. I want to say there's 23 Department of Corrections prisons in the state. That's up quite a bit from 20 years ago. Our population, our prison population, has actually trended downwards the last 4 or 5 years. There's been a lot of criminal justice reform measures. Decriminalization of marijuana is one of them. Under this governor, the last 2 governors, they've loosened up some of the parole rules and regulations in a way that I think is probably not real bright. But in any ways, that's helped contribute to a lowering of the inmate population in the state. One of the things that happens is, the question pointed out, none of these prisons are in the Chicago area. They're all downstate. And they become, in a small town, a prison that could employ 1,000 people. That's probably on the high end, let's say 500 or 600 people. That is the economic engine for that town, particularly because a lot of these other industries have gone away, or the agriculture industry doesn't employ as many people as it used to. So a sort of a political culture develops around that prison and in sustaining that prison, because being a prison guard is a really tough job, but it pays well with benefits and everything else. And then there's an institution like that, a big government institution. It's not only the people who work at the prison that benefit from the prison being there, the entire town's economy benefits from it. The restaurants, obviously, sell food to the prison guards, and the doctors and the lawyers and the dentists and everyone else are there to sustain that part of the economy. So there is a political push to maintain, the level of prisons we have right now, and it sometimes makes for strange political bedfellows, okay? Because the political culture in these towns is mostly conservative, leaning Republican. But they're big union towns, and that they're government union towns. Most of the people that work in the prisons are part of AFSCME, the biggest government employees union, and they tend to be Democratic. So it creates this sort of clash. And it's kind of an interesting political dynamic. We didn't get too deep into these things, but Governor Rauner, very much an anti-union politician, but one who's done well downstate because of the more conservative political culture there. Those two things are clashing right now in this election, and I think it's one of the reasons why, if you look at the public opinion polling, that Governor Rauner is not doing very well, is because these worlds have sort of have collided. It's an interesting sort of political subtext in the state. But that's, you describe, instead of a tractor factory or agriculture employing people in a lot of these towns, Menard, Illinois, places like that, the Pontiac, Illinois, the prison is really the economic engine in the town.
Other questions?
How often do you coordinate with your federal counterparts within Congress, like with spending in your district, transportation, like you touched on earlier? Because I know those are some big issues within our area.
Like directly person to person, very little on that level of spending. That's mostly handled by bureaucrats in Springfield. Medicaid would be an example of a high level of interaction between federal and state. Transportation too, spending on roadways. Most of my interaction with our congressional delegation comes to basic, simple constituent services. We have someone who comes into the office who got hurt at work, isn't getting paid. We make sure they get the unemployment benefits. Maybe Social Security disability. We'll call the congressman, Dan Lipinski is the congressman for most but not all of my district. We'll call his office, make sure that's coordinated. We have a lot of problems with railroads in my districts. That's a federal regulatory problem, but a lot of my constituents will come to me about it. We go to Congressman Lipinski, go to Senators Durbin or Duckworth, and on sort of a case-by-case constituent service basis work with their office. For me personally, that's mostly where I interact with the feds.
Just on that same topic of federalism, you mentioned how the number one contact was about property taxes. Could you speak a little bit about who sets property taxes?
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot of people don't really understand how this works. But property taxes are assessed and collected by local government agencies, okay? When you pay, and you can look at your property tax bill, if you live with your parents, at your parents' property tax bill, and they'll lay out all the local government agencies that tax your property. And any bill has anywhere between 10 or 12 local government agencies. Moraine Valley is one, so it's very small, but they have a property tax levy. Your local town, if you live here in Palos Hills, there's a Palos Hills line item on your property tax. There's a Cook County. There's a South Suburban mosquito abatement. There's a water reclamation district. By far and away, though, the biggest chunk of your property taxes goes to your local K through 12 school district. That can range, depending on where you live in the state, anywhere from just over 50% of your property tax bill to 80% of your property tax bill goes to your local school district. The state has nothing to do with the collection and spending of that money, not directly. Some would argue correctly that we have contributed to that property tax bill increasing by not providing enough funding to local school districts for education. I'm sometimes amazed, how how many voters, residents don't understand that, because it's, and that's why it's helpful to have people engaged and active and understanding the issues. But, I would say a good percentage, not most, but a good percentage of my constituents, when we talk about taxation, don't realize that. One of the things I'm amazed by is talks about seniors. I was talking to you about seniors earlier. In Illinois, we do not tax retirement income. We're one of only a couple of states that's true. So if you're getting a pension, you're getting Social Security benefits, you're getting dividends from a retirement plan, an IRA retirement plan, the state does not tax you. I can't tell you how many senior citizens I represent. One time I was knocking on doors in Worth, and on one block I got into an argument with 4 different senior citizens who claim they pay income taxes to the state. I said, no, you do not. I pay income taxes. I said, you pay income taxes to the federal government. You do not pay income taxes to the state. If you do, you need to fire your accountant and report him to the authorities because he is ripping you off. But it's amazing how many senior citizens think they pay an income tax to the state when they do not. So, there's sometimes these gaps in public knowledge that, really contribute to some of the problems we have in the state because people don't, at their core, understand taxation issues.
So you mentioned that on your tax bill you have many individual taxing bodies. Isn't that really one of the big problems we have in Illinois, is that we have one of the highest number of individual taxing bodies? And what is the state legislator doing about possibly consolidating some of those?
So yeah, it is true. We have the highest number of local government bodies in the country, compared to other states. Some of that is because of our size. There's some smaller states that have a higher per capita number of local government bodies, but still it's a definite problem in the state. This year we passed a bill to allow for consolidation of one form of government, township government, by referendum. So voters in a township can vote to collapse that. I forget the exact number of local government bodies we have in the state. I want to say it's like 7,000, something like that. School districts really contribute to this. We have over 800 local school districts in the state of Illinois. That really fuels it. Some areas, including here in the southwest suburbs, but it's more pronounced really downstate. We have school districts with like boundaries, the same boundaries, but different districts for K through 12 and high school. To me, we should find a way to consolidate that and have one school district that will cut the bureaucracy, only one superintendent, one level of support staff. That's what we call a unit district when it's combined K through 12. That's one way to cut that down. We have a lot, particularly downstate, single school districts where there's just one school in the district. They have a principal, a superintendent, a school board. There should be consolidation done when that happens. That, I think, is one of the best ways to do it, but there is gigantic opposition to that. Everyone says they want fewer government bodies, but then when you put a bill out there, as we have, okay, let's consolidate schools, the world catches on fire. No, consolidate someone else. Don't consolidate my school district. So that's what makes it hard, but there's no reason for there to be mosquito abatement districts. The county health department should be able to do that, so we have legislation pending to do things like that. I don't know why we need Cook County Forest Preserve District and Cook County government. There's two government bodies. They can be consolidated. There's a lot of things we can and should do like that.
In terms of making a difference and being able to get your attention, how many emails or phone calls do you think it takes to be able to influence your elected official?
Yeah, if I get one email from a constituent, I pay attention to that. I will respond to it, explain what I'm thinking, or learn more. A lot of times constituents bring issues to me that I know nothing about, and it gives me an opportunity to learn about it. It's an interesting thing, and this kind of gets to more in depth when I talk to political science students. Like, well, what's day in and day out like? How do you consider your vote on an issue? Do you do it on your personal conscience? Do you vote the way you think your constituents want you to vote? Do you vote based on what you think's best for the greater good of the state? Those are all things you have to balance. But I try to, as much as possible, vote the way I think my constituents want me to do. That's my number one, guidance. But that's hard to do. I can't take a political opinion poll on every issue. So I have to do that based on my gut and based in part on what I hear from constituents. But that doesn't always give you an accurate position, depending on the issue. Like, for instance, I'll give you an issue, guns, okay? Gun control measures. If there's a gun control measure, like this year we had a thing to regulate licensed gun shops. Most of the emails I got, like if I just kept a tally of how many are for this and how many are against this, I hear more from pro-gun people than I do from anti-gun people. And we'll speak in sweeping generalities here for a second. But I've seen actual public opinion polls that I've conducted when I've run for re-election of my constituents attitudes about guns, and I know I represent, based on these scientific polls, an overwhelmingly pro-gun control district based on these polls. You would not know that by monitoring my emails. And that's because people, pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights people are very well organized and are very active in contacting their elected representatives, also very well funded. It's similar to what I was talking to earlier about how we hear from seniors more than other groups. That's one of the reasons why, when there's these school shootings and people wonder, well, why aren't we, why isn't Congress or local state legislatures, why aren't they passing bills to address this? Look at the public opinion polls. People are overwhelmingly for this. It's because of a small but well-educated, well-organized, relentless effort by a group. And sometimes a minority group can, because they're active, because they're engaged, will have an outsource, a louder voice than they should. And legislators, you hear all this noise and fury coming from one direction, that's hard to ignore. Even if you did do a public opinion poll 2 years ago that says, oh, no, they're in the minority. So you have to be, getting to your initial question, you have to be, obviously I weigh what I hear from my constituents and apply to how I'm going to vote. But you have to be careful about it. You can't just say, oh, I got 6 emails telling me to vote yes on this bill and 2 to vote no, therefore I'm going to vote yes. You have to be careful about that.
I just wanted to tie that in. I know we're out of time here. My class, American Government, we were scheduled to cover interest groups today, and in so many ways, Senator Cunningham covered it way better than I ever would have. So you kind of see the role of participation, of getting organized, of contacting your elected officials. With that in mind, we still have time to register to vote. So if you guys are interested in finding out how to do that, please contact me. If you're interested in events like this, then we have a democracy hour on Monday. This Monday we have an event in U111 called Ethical Dilemmas with Genetic Engineering and Artificial Intelligence. I really want to thank Troy and Tara and the library for hosting today's event. And a special thanks to Senator Cunningham. If you guys could join me in.
Thank you. Thanks. Really enjoyed it. Really good questions, too. Thanks.
And thank you all for coming and asking those great questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks.